It's time for another one of my year-specific rankings where I rank all the films I've seen from a particular year, and today I'm doing 2005. We're halfway through the noughties, baby. Come on! Now that we're done with the intro, I can now reveal I have seen 21 films from this particular year, and I'm going to be ranking them all today from worst to best. I think 2005 is just marginally better than 2004 in terms of quality. Certainly the top 5 today, much better, I would say, than the top 5 that I had for 2004. Before we get into it, a quick reminder, the top 2 films today will go through to the eventual grand final of 100 films, where I will be declaring once and for all what the greatest film of all time is. But for now, let's concentrate on 2005, and we'll start with the film that I consider to be the worst one that I have seen from 2005. This is what you might call a thought-provoking, hard-hitting drama. It's about a paedophile who likes to pick up these 14, 15-year-old girls on the internet, take them back to his swanky house in LA and have sex with them, basically, and then never see them again, presumably. But the latest girl he picks up is onto him. She had a friend who was one of this guy's victims, and it's implied that he may have even killed this particular girl. So the latest girl, played by Ellen Page, I believe, she lets herself become this guy's latest date. She goes back to his house with him, but at the first opportunity, she drugs him, ties him up, and basically explains to him that she's going to perform some kind of surgery on his balls to make sure that he never has sex with a girl again. She doesn't get straight into this. She spends a hell of a long time talking to the guy about how bad he is and why what he does is wrong, etc., etc. It's a very talky film. But it's sort of set up in this that the guy might not be who she thinks he is. When I was watching this, because this guy was so nice and he's not obviously a monster, I thought to myself, is it possible that there's going to be a twist here where it turns out she's got the wrong guy, because he's claiming that he's not the guy she thinks he is. So I didn't know how this was going to end. I'm not going to spoil what happens in the finale, because if you fancy watching it, go for it, and I'll leave the ending for you to discover. But I personally felt very flat at the end with what they decided to do with this. It's not really my sort of film, you know. I don't like films about rapists or statutory rapists, whatever. You know, if a rapist is in a film as a fairly small part, then fine. But a film where a rapist is actually centre stage is not really for me. So I didn't really like this film. I actually bought it, I think, when it was just out on DVD, and I quickly sold it again a couple of weeks later. You know, I quite like the Doom games, but just the old ones, the old classic ones. I've got them on my PS4, I put them on now and again and just do a few levels. I don't like the more modern Doom games, I just can't get into them at all. I wasn't expecting much from this movie adaptation because I'd heard that it was absolute garbage, and what I got was pretty much garbage. It's a really boring film. I mean, surely they could have done better from this. This does not feel like any version of Doom I have ever played. I think this was an early film for Dwayne Johnson. If it is, it's a wonder that he went on to have a career after this film. And Rosamund Pike's in it. I can't believe she would be in a film like this. She is such a better actress than this. What I most remember from the Doom film is this really cringeworthy scene where they try and replicate the feel of the game. So they have this scene where it becomes like a first-person perspective, and you just see this Marine going up these stairs and monsters are coming out, and it's meant to feel like the games, but I can't imagine that would satisfy either fans of the games or people who are not fans of the games. It's just not very well thought out at all. I went through a phase where I knew this Polish woman at work, and she used to lend me films that apparently I just had to see, and probably I lent her one or two. Our tastes didn't really align, to be honest, but I still took this woman's films anyway and watched them. I think at the time it was just sort of cool to have a film buddy at work, if you know what I mean. She lent me all sorts of random shit, though. The Producers with Gene Wilder. It took me about 8 sittings to get through that film. I just couldn't stand it. And this film, again, I couldn't really get into it. I've no problem with Men sleeping with men in the countryside, absolutely fine, but as a film, I just didn't find it that exciting. Even if this had been a film about a straight couple having a romance in the countryside, it still wouldn't have done anything for me. I'm not into romances or dramas particularly. Every now and again I am, but this film was not that rare exception, if you see what I mean. So, yeah, this one was always going to come low down today. Now we're into the films that I can sort of praise a little bit. This is a family film about a family who have this dog called Winn-Dixie, a bit of a strange name for a dog. I can't actually remember what happens in this. The family have a few domestic escapades and the dog is usually at ground zero. I think maybe the father of this family is trying to get a new girlfriend. Maybe. I don't know. It's been a long time since I saw it. It's the sort of film that I would never watch solo, but I think I watched it on a date night with my wife, maybe when we were having takeaway or something. And if you're watching it as a couple, it's the sort of film that's all right, you know. But again, still not my thing at all. Another video game adaptation, we are truly blessed today. I was a massive fan of Final Fantasy VII back in the day. I played it for the first time at university, and it helped me de-stress after many a difficult day on coursework, believe me. I couldn't really get into the remake that came out on PS4. I got about halfway through that, I think, and I just had to quit. It just didn't capture the magic of that older version. This animated film didn't do that much for me either. I sort of remember it being a bit too cartoony and throwaway. I mean, one thing I loved about the original game is that it was really serious, it was emotional, but I just didn't get any of that from this Advent Children film. And to be honest, if I had to go back to any Final Fantasy film now, it would absolutely be The Spirits Within from 2001 and not this one. This is a film which got a lot of attention when it came out. People were saying it was like this hard-hitting drama that dealt with issues to do with race and discrimination, and possibly there would be Oscars just around the corner. I got swept up in all this and bought a DVD copy without having seen it, but about halfway through the film, I remember thinking, this isn't really that good, is it really? It's just a bit boring. Looking back on the film now, having not touched it for 15 years, I honestly can't remember anything about it. I can recall one scene in my mind's eye, which is when Thandie Newton, I think, ends up in an overturned car and has to be pulled out. Apart from that, I couldn't tell you what the story's about. I couldn't tell you anything else. Literally, my mind's just a complete blank. As for award ceremonies and things, I don't know whether this film went on to fulfill its promise on that score. I don't really follow the Oscars and the Golden Globes and things like that, but certainly this film was apparently the bee's knees at the time, but I certainly didn't see it that way once I watched it. This brings back the memories, and we're definitely into the good films now. I watched this a couple of times back in the day. I think I had a DVD at one point and again gave it away. It's a hard film to describe to someone who's never seen it. It's like an adult comic book but shot in a really weird style with lots of greys. It's not one long story. It's sort of like an anthology with 2, 3, 4 stories all loosely connected. My favourite one was absolutely the one with Elijah Wood playing this absolute psychopath who feels no pain, and there was another good one about this yellow-faced killer, from what I can recall. This film got a sequel at some point, I'm sure I did, but I never saw that. It totally wasn't on my radar when it came out. Not like this original film was when this first appeared. Talking about it now has really made me want to revisit it. Literally, I saw it twice back on release and just never even given it a moment's thought since. This is about a huge armada of metallic aliens that come out of the Earth's core and start zapping everybody to death. I watched it quite recently on holiday. I watched it with my son, and I was a little bit nervous throughout that there might at some point be some imagery that would give him nightmares, but thankfully I think we got through the film unscathed. But it's not one of Tom Cruise's better efforts. It's just a little bit bland. It just feels like it's lacking inspiration. I watched it quite close together to my first ever viewing of Edge of Tomorrow, actually. Both films sci-fi horror loosely, but Edge of Tomorrow is absolutely the superior film of the two, a film that I would definitely go back to. Not so sure I ever want to go back to War of the Worlds. It was all right, just nothing spectacular. And I think My main memory of it in the future will just be that little nostalgic ting of, oh, I once watched that on holiday with my son sort of thing. This is a film that I desperately need to watch again because the one time I watched it, I think it was a couple of nights after I'd just watched House of a Thousand Corpses for the first time, and there's a lot to take in that film. So I don't think I was quite mentally ready for another film which is so different from the first one, because this is a trilogy and The Devil's Rejects is the second film in that trilogy, but it goes in a completely different direction from the first one. The only thing that I truly loved about this straight off the bat was the opening, actually, when the cops come and chase is it the Firefly family? When the cops come and chase them off their property and this one family member dresses up like RoboCop. I thought that was absolutely amazing, but on the whole, I think I will enjoy The Devil's Rejects better the second time, but it's just getting around to it. You know, every week there are hundreds, thousands of different films clamouring for my attention, and somehow I just never get around to it. I've never even seen Three from Hell yet. I need to do that as well. At worst, this is a very, very good film, and at best, a lot of people think that this is Rob Zombie's best film. I can't see myself ever going that far with it because I love his Halloween films too much, in all honesty. I'm having a weird case of deja vu with this one, like I might have talked about it on the channel before, but I can't actually remember in what video that would have been. I hope it's not the case that I also included it in my 2004 ranking. Sometimes films are released in different countries in different years, and I have to decide which ranking to put them in, therefore. But even if this film did accidentally get two stabs of the cherry, and I'm still not entirely sure that it has, it never would have made the grand final. It's a very good Western set in Australia, made in Australia. I think Ray Winstone's in it, Guy Pearce, and there's a brilliant part for John Hurt as well. It's a very gritty, grimy sort of Western, very well written, very well made. It's not a very well known film, but it's absolutely worth your time. It's decent. There's not a lot of difference between what I would call my favourite Star Wars film and my least favourite. So my favourite's probably The Force Awakens. My least favourite, most likely, is The Phantom Menace. But honestly, I could put either of those two films on right now and still have a really good time. These films are very, very consistent. Revenge of the Sith, a lot of people think this is the best film of the prequels, but I kind of disagree with that. I prefer Attack of the Clones. I just think it's a better film visually. It's got more interesting action sequences. I can tolerate all that crappy sand dialogue that you get halfway through. My favourite parts in Revenge of the Sith, well, there's two of them that come to mind. Firstly, the big battle near the start, that's amazing. And secondly, anything to do with General Grievous. I think he's an absolutely awesome villain in this. As we've been going through these yearly rankings, I've noticed that pretty much every Star Wars film usually comes halfway up or just past halfway. It's the same with Star Trek. I'm not going to dwell too long on this one because I've literally just got done recently doing a full Batman franchise rankings where I did talk a little bit about Batman Begins. When this came out, it was like a breath of fresh air. I mean, the film before it was Batman and Robin. Watching this for the first time was like having a bath after spending all day working in a sewage works. I don't actually work in a sewage works. Looking at the film from a 2022 perspective, I do think it's the worst of the three Christopher Nolan ones. Rewatching it is a little bit of a chore for the first 30-40 minutes for me because I'm just sort of waiting to get to the point where Batman is in Gotham City. It's why I don't necessarily enjoy rewatching origin films. For example, Casino Royale will never be my favourite of the Daniel Craig Bond films, whereas for some people it is. But I don't want to be too critical about Batman Begins because there are Batman films out there that genuinely do deserve scorn and criticism, and when all's said and done, Batman Begins is still a really solid film, at least the first time that you watch it. So we just had Batman and Star Wars, now we've got Harry Potter, so lots of major franchises jostling for position today in the middle of the rankings, causing a bit of a bottleneck. When the novel for Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire came out, I think that was the point where the series was really starting to take off. It was starting to become a phenomenon because it didn't happen straight away. It took a few books. When there were 4 books out, that was when I started reading them and following them. And I still think to this day that The Goblet of Fire is one of the very best novels. And I think it's probably one of the best films as well. There's a lot of series highlights, I think, squeezed into this one film because of the Triwizard Cup. You've got the Maze section, which is great. the dragon game thing, the underwater part, you know, lots of really strong action sequences. And this is a very important film in the context of the overall franchise, because there's 8 films in total. This is the 4th one. There's a big development that happens at the end of the 4th one, which really changes the landscape going into the 5th film. So you could almost look at this whole series as 2 halves, and the Goblet of Fire is the end of that first half, if you see what I mean. But at some point I'm going to do a ranking for this franchise. I haven't watched a lot of the films for quite some time, but definitely I think the Goblet of Fire will do very well in that list. Welcome to day 2 of me filming this video, and the eagle-eyed among you may have already noticed that the background has slightly changed. That's because me and my wife have used the opportunity of the Jubilee bank holiday to finally decorate our living room, long overdue. But anyway, back to the rankings, and here we have arguably yet another big franchise with George Romero's Of the Dead series, because this was his big thing. He did 6 of these films across a span of 40 years. When Land of the Dead came out, it was the first time that he'd done one in about 20 years. And the first time I watched this, it was a little bit jarring seeing Romero doing a more modern zombie film. But I've rewatched it over time, and it gets better with each viewing. It's got a very comic book feel, this one. There's lots of great action, great kills. I like the armoured truck thing. John Leguizamo is amazing in this film, and I like the fact that there's this one really intelligent zombie who pretty much survives the whole thing. I don't think the film quite shows you the horror of what it would be like to be trapped in a tower block with zombies sort of rising up, because this film for a long time threatens to be like the Die Hard of zombie films, which would have been amazing. But it sort of goes a different way in the last sort of 15-20 minutes, which is slightly disappointing the first time you watch the film. But overall, I definitely feel like this is one of the most underrated films in this franchise, because it's usually Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead that get all the plaudits. If this channel goes on for quite a long time, I will definitely get around to reviewing this entire series. I like these films. There are 3 films in the Hostel franchise. In my opinion, only the first one is worth your time. I think I did briefly own Hostel 2, but I watched it once. It wasn't for me, gave it away. And I tried to watch Hostel 3 on the TV as well, and I don't think I even got through the whole film of that. This first one, though, I've gone back to it now and again. It does have a reputation as being sort of the quintessential torture porn film of the noughties, but I don't think it's as graphic as its reputation. A lot of what makes Hostel great is the fact that there is a hell of a lot of tension as you go on this journey with these backpackers into Slovakia, I think it is, and they discover this dodgy criminal organisation where people can basically pay to torture people. It's sort of implied that human beings need this secretly. Bullshit. But within the framework of the film, it is very believable somehow, and there is a lot of tension in this. It's a suspenseful watch. It is gory at times, but there's not actually that much torture in it, I would argue. It's a very good film, and it's one of the only DVDs I've ever bought that has 4 commentary tracks on it. I mean, who the hell would want to watch 4 different commentary tracks for the same movie? So we go from one torture porn film to another. Saw 2 for me is the absolute best of the franchise. It took everything that was good about the first film and then just improved it 150%. The big twist this time around is that instead of people doing their own individual traps, we've got a whole bunch of people thrown together to do a kind of group test with little individual sub-traps sprinkled throughout the film. And that, to me, just works so much better than what they did with Saw 1. All my favourite Saw films tend to involve groups working together, so I've got a lot of time for Saw 5. I really like the 8th one, which was just called Jigsaw. There were some great individual traps in this film as well, though. The needle pit's great. The one with the woman's hands going into the glass cage, the furnace, and also there's a great twist at the end of the film. If you thought the twist at the end of Saw 1 was great, you ain't seen nothing yet, because I just thought what they did at the end of this film was just so clever. There's a great one-off villain in Javier. He is so funny. Some of the shit that he comes out with in this film is just absolutely great. So yeah, for me, of all 9 Saw films, this is where the whole thing peaked, right here with Saw 2, and yet it still gets nowhere near my grand final. This is a superb modern day war film. I can't remember which conflict it involves, Iraq or Afghanistan, one of those I think. The film concerns American soldiers who are sent over into a conflict and then they're not actually used. They're sort of kept in like a base, and their call up to go into the fighting just never seems to happen. And the film shows you the frustrations and the psychological problems of that. I mean, personally, if I try to imagine myself going off to Iraq or somewhere, I think I'd be quite happy to stay in the base and not be required to fight. But that's not how soldiers are trained, and presumably they've got their friends who are out doing missions and stuff, and they just want to be out there making their contributions, doing their bit for their country. And this film sort of shows you just how hard it is for these soldiers to be fully trained, ready to go, and they just never get the green light to go into battle. It shows as well that when it comes to war films, you don't just have to have them filled with constant action and battles to make them enjoyable, because this film is a little bit light on that kind of stuff, obviously, but still very, very engrossing, and I was very impressed with this, I've got to say. I remembered this film being really, really good, but I couldn't actually remember the story or what it was about, so I actually had to go and get it off the shelf just to sort of read the back of the box and remind myself, because I don't think I've seen this for like 3 or 4 years. But anyway, I'll read out what it's about. It's about a secret Israeli squad assigned to track down and assassinate the 11 Palestinians believed to have planned the 1972 Munich massacre of 11 Israeli athletes. Now you can understand why I decided to read the box instead of just try and remember that, because it's a bit of a mouthful. I would have just completely stuttered my way through that. Very good spy film. I think set in the 70s, obviously. It's full of twists and surprises, great drama. Daniel Craig's in it. I think this might have been his last film before Casino Royale. He does a South African accent in this. He does so many different accents in his films. Obviously, most of us know him from doing Bond, but he also did Knives Out, where he was playing somebody from Texas. He did a very, very thick sort of Texas accent in that. And in this, he really pulls off a South African accent. His versatility is very impressive. But this film is absolutely worth your time. It's about 2.5 hours long. But now that I've pulled it off the shelf, I'm sort of tempted to get it on tonight and watch it for what would only be the second time. It's really, really good. So now we've reached the unlucky film, which doesn't quite make it into the grand final. Wolf Creek is amazing. The first time I saw it is quite the story, because it was actually my brother that discovered this film for me, and he said, come round to my house, I'll make you some dinner and I'll show you this great horror film I've discovered. I said, okay, totally up for that. The trouble is, this was years ago when he was still living in some kind of shared accommodation. He was living with a bunch of girls, and when I went round, there was nobody in apart from him, and so we sat in the living room and put this film on, and I was gripped by it. I mean, this film just grabs you and doesn't let you go. But about halfway through, all these pissed up housemates of his and some of their friends came back, like a whole bunch of girls. They all burst into the living room, yakking over the movie and plonking themselves here, down, there and everywhere, and it just totally ruined the mood of the film. And inside I was seething. I was like, oh, I didn't ask for all these hot women to come and sit next to me. I was in the middle of watching this great horror film. So my viewing that on that particular night was a little bit spoiled, but I'd liked the film so much of what I did see that I instantly went out and bought my own copy of the film, and then I got to enjoy it at home, and it's fantastic. Easily the best Australian horror film I've ever seen. I don't want to say what it's about, just in case you haven't seen it, because part of what made my first viewing of this so great was the fact that I didn't know what the threat of the movie was until like halfway through. In 2022, that might be harder for somebody, because this has become a bit of a famous franchise now. I think I first watched the film in like 2009, maybe. Back then, there was only one film. Now there's like 2 films, a TV show with 2 seasons, and I think they're still talking about making a 3rd film to sort of cap off a trilogy. It is a little bit of a famous franchise now, at least if you follow horror. So I don't know what the odds are that you'd be able to watch this film now without knowing what the main threat is. But regardless, check this film out, because it's an amazing horror film. So we're now up to the top 2, aren't we? So let's find out, therefore, which is the first of today's films going through to the grand final. This is another one I had to get off my shelf just to remind myself what it was about. According to the back of the box, it's about a Frenchman who travels to Jerusalem during the Crusades, and then, from what I can remember, he gets involved in loads of political intrigue and huge, large-scale battles with local tribes and stuff. But in my head, all I could remember is that it was this really cool medieval war film, and that wouldn't have sounded very good, given the fact that apparently it's number 2 on my list. But I think I've only seen it a couple of times, and both viewings were quite some time ago. Now, I've got the extended director's cut, which is about 3 hours and 10 minutes long. You do have to free up a whole evening for this, but it's a fantastic film. It's gorgeous to look at. The quality of it is absolutely undeniable. Ridley Scott's the director. It's not quite as emotional as something like Gladiator, but it's a sumptuously good film. I can't praise it highly enough. It's got some great actors in it. Orlando Bloom, Jeremy Irons, Liam Neeson, Eva Green, and I'm surprised it's not a film with a bigger reputation. I think possibly what might have hurt it is that it had this theatrical release, which is a lot shorter than the version you can get now, so it's a little bit of a Batman v Superman sort of situation, or Justice League, pick your poison, but great film, and it is almost certainly going through to my grand final. But let's find out which film pipped it into the number 1 position. This is literally one of the scariest horror films I've ever seen. I saw it not long after it came out. It's directed by a guy called Neil Marshall, who also did the film Dog Soldiers, which I've not seen. This one's about a group of women, 6 women, and they go potholing in Canada somewhere, but they get lost under the ground, which would make for a really frightening horror film itself. But there are also these humanoid creatures down there who, they're completely blind, but they get about just with their hearing abilities. So these women are in serious peril. It doesn't sound like a great film, and I just explained the plot like that, but honestly, it's absolutely terrifying. It's done so well. The atmosphere in these caves is just fantastic. The characterization among the main women is really well done. There's a gut punch of an ending, and honestly, it's just one of the best horror films I've ever seen. The last time I did my top 100 horror films of all time list a couple of years back, I think I had The Descent like hovering somewhere around the top 10, top 20. For me, it's an absolute masterpiece of a horror film. Maybe you won't see it that way when you see it, but honestly, I was astounded when I saw this film. I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and very easy for me to put this one number 1 today, and we will be seeing it again in the grand final. Right, just so I could avoid having to design a title card saying what films from 2005 would I also have liked to have seen, I'll just quickly read out some films that I made a note of that I've not yet watched. Ring 2, The Amityville Horror, another remake for that series, House of Wax, Red Eye, Exorcism of Emily Rose, Flight Plan, and Domino. Right, that is it for my 2005 rankings. We've got The Descent and Kingdom of Heaven going through to the grand final. I'll be back soon to do a rankings for 2006. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.